Today on the Nivlac 57 YouTube channel, we're going to show you how to prepare a Junkyard LS for big power. Alright guys, to start the video off, I'm going to give a little bit of a disclaimer. These are just things that have worked for us. I make no guarantees that they will work for you at all, or you will have the same success that we have had in the past. Now, we've gone through quite a few engines figuring out this formula, and you're going to notice that we don't take certain shortcuts that a lot of other people do. I'm not bashing those other people. I'm not trying to say that they're wrong or anything like that. Frankly, I totally get where they may be coming from. And as Matt Happel always says, it comes down to your goals. For us, we oftentimes are towing 1,000 miles to go and race our car. So we are not willing to take certain shortcuts that may put us at risk of not being able to complete the event. And therefore, we do certain things like look at the cam bearings. Now, I should say that our budget limited stuff, obviously, we have to take certain shortcuts just because we can't spend any money. But on our non-budget limited stuff, there are certain things that we do in order to help us to be successful. So obviously this engine's already together, but let's go back in time to when we started putting this thing together and show you how we did it. So right off the bat, we start with a bare block, as you can see here. What we're building today is a aluminum 6-liter that will be prepared for naturally aspirated use and maybe a little bit of spray. I know this is extremely unpopular, but you need to look at your cam bearings. For the very low budget builds, if they look mostly intact, you're fine. But for the guys that really don't want to have any issues, it may be a good idea to replace them if you see any issues. While you're replacing them, you can also upgrade them to the later style active fuel management cam bearings, which have a little bit more bearing surface and give the camshaft a little bit more area to ride on. That's what we've done to this engine. This block happens to be an LS2. And we're going to essentially be reassembling it as an LS2, except we're going to use a truck 6-liter rotating assembly and a sloppy stage 2. So the next thing to consider is bearing clearances. There's a lot of dispute in the stock bottom end LS world. A lot of people seem to have a lot of success with the completely boneyard stock engines. And then there's a lot of people that really struggle and have frequent failures and just generally have a bad time. It seems like the guys that have the most success with the Junkyard Fresh motors choose higher mileage engines, which may have had a little bit of bearing touchdown and maybe loosened up the bearings a little bit. That's my theory anyways. Now on today's engine, I'm actually going to be measuring the bearing clearance, but for the guys that are lazy, you may be able to get away with just installing the extra clearance bearings, which I will be showing you today. As the old adage goes, if the bearings are too loose, nobody's gonna know. If the bearings are too tight, everybody's gonna know. So what am I talking about? Bearings with extra clearance? Well, if you're doing a rebuild like we're doing today, you can buy aftermarket bearings which have that extra clearance already built into them. Now, what you want to look for are these. These are your rod bearings. You'll notice in your part number that it has an X. What the X means is it has extra clearance. To be exact, it has an extra thousandths of clearance. So like the rods, we also have main bearings that have the extra 1,000ths of clearance. Here is the part number for them. The stock bearing clearances are usually around 1.5 to 2,000ths of clearance. So if you add this extra 1,000ths of clearance, it should get you up around the area of where you should really be which is around 3 to 3.5 if you're going to make big power. So let's get the X bearings installed and clamped down in our block and measure the clearances to see if it works at all. Alright, so to check main bearing clearance, what you need to have is your crankshaft that you plan to use. And in our case, that is a truck 6-liter crankshaft, which we have here. So to measure bearing clearance, you need a micrometer, which you will put around the main journal. And you basically want to measure the main journal of the particular main that you're looking at. In my case, I'm looking at main journal number 1. And you need to set the micrometer to the diameter of that main bearing. Then you need something called a dial bore gauge. I bought this one cheap off of Summit Racing, and what you basically need to do with this is you need to zero it out on your micrometer, and then you can check your main bearing clearance. All right, now that I've zeroed my dial bore gauge on my micrometer, I can insert it into my main bearings, which I've already torqued down, and I can see what my main bearing clearance is. To do this, you basically swing the thing back and forth and get to the peak number that you read on your gauge here. And in my case, that is just a tick over 3 thousandths, and we're going to call that good enough. Now you just have to repeat that for all of the other bearings, and you need to basically go through each bearing with your micrometer, set it, and you basically just repeat those steps for all of the other bearings. Now also, you may want to check your rod bearing clearance, and we'll do that in a second. And most of the time when you install 2 X bearing shells into the rod bearing, it gives you around 3 thousandths of clearance on the rod, which is perfect. All right, so we just went through all of our main bearing clearances, and they're all right around 3 thousandths of an inch, which is right around where I would want to put them. Next, we're going to move to crankshaft end play. Now before you tighten the center main cap down, you need to set the thrust bearing. To do that, you just tap on both ends of the crank, one way and then the other, and then you can tighten down the center main bearing. This is such an easy thing to check, so we check it every single time. And you basically need a dial indicator setup very similar to this one. Essentially, you are measuring how much the crankshaft can move either way, and it needs to be within a certain tolerance. Normally we do like 3 to 8 thousandths. I think that's the factory spec. For trans brake usage, you will probably want to run it on the loose side of that. Once you have your dial indicator pointing at the tip of the crank, you basically just take the crankshaft and you flex it one way, zero it out, and then flex it the other way. Looks like we are right on 4 thousandths of an inch, so we're good to go. I don't know if I've ever had one that spun over this nice. Alright guys, the next step is to get these pistons cleaned up, and the reason that we do that is oftentimes there is a lot of carbon buildup on the pistons, and you definitely don't want your rings to get sticky or not be able to move around like they should. And it's also a good time to check everything over and make sure that it is good to go. Similar to the mains, you need to consider rod bearing clearance. And again, Clevite sells a extra clearance bearing. These rods happen to have the stock bearings in them, so just for fun I measured the factory rod bearing clearance. It came out to pretty much right on the factory specs, which is 1.5 thousandths of bearing clearance. This could be pretty bad for the higher horsepower efforts. This rod happens to have some ARP rod bolts installed. Now this is another point of contention. We normally don't run ARP rod bolts. We've had stock rod bolts up to 7,800 RPM and 1,000 horsepower, never had an issue, but these rods already have ARP rod bolts, so we're probably just gonna run them. A lot of people say it's helpful to have rod bolts if you plan to rev it high or go for big power because it gives the rod more clamping force and supposedly holds its shape better. We've never had an issue, but since it has it there already, we're good to go. That being said, a lot of people also say with rod bolts that you need to hone your rod for the additional clamping force. Basically, as these bolts clamp down, it distorts the rod and makes it more of an oval shape, and you need to hone the rod. And I don't know if you need to go to a different bearing or how that works. And that's one good reason I would probably stay away from it. That being said, we measured the bearing clearance with the X bearings installed, and the rod bearing clearance came out right around 3 thousandths of an inch. Like I said before, I'd rather be a little bit loose because nobody's gonna know. So let's get these cleaned up and installed. Alright, so when you're cleaning your piston, you gotta be careful. You don't want to get your rings out of order. On these 6-liter pistons, that's actually pretty easy to keep in order because both rings have a dot on the top, and the top and bottom rings are 2 different thicknesses. So we just take them off, make sure you keep them in orientation as they go on the piston. Pop your oil control rings off. Obviously this piston was a fairly low mileage piston. Everything looks to be in fairly nice shape. So it's coming apart easy and it's not super dirty, so I'm thankful for that. It's really helpful if you have an extra ring that you can use to clean the piston with. What you basically do with the ring is you break it in half like this, and then you insert it into the ring groove on the piston, and you basically just work it around the piston, and that breaks all of the carbon buildup loose. So once I get this cleaned up, I got 7 more to clean up, and then we got a ring gap and install these pistons. Alright, next we have to check the ring end gap. So there's like a billion videos on how to do this on the internet. So in fast forward, basically you have to push your ring into the bore like this, and then you need to square it up in the bore using your piston. Then you use these things called feeler gauges, which are very precisely machined, essentially shims, and you try different thicknesses of those as basically go no-go gauges, and that tells you what the distance between the ring end gap is. So normally I try to set up the ring gap at 25 to 30 thousandths for boosted or nitrous applications. In the case of this motor, I'm going to set it at 25 thousandths because it will be mostly naturally aspirated, but it could see a shot of nitrous someday. So how do you set the ring gap? Essentially you check it, and if it's too narrow, you use your ring grinding tool that looks like this. Essentially you just butt the ring up into the tool, you grind a little off, and it's basically guess and check until you measure out the right ring gap. Now that you've set your ring gap, cleaned your piston, measured your rod bearing clearance, it is time to install the rod and piston into the engine. Now to do that, it is really helpful to have one of these, which is a tapered ring compressing tool, and it essentially has a taper built into it so that It basically funnels the rings down into the bore. Don't forget to apply a little bit of assembly lube to your rod bearing. And don't forget to lube the bore to allow the piston to slide in nicely. Also, you want to orient your rings. Normally we orient them so that they are facing just a little bit away from where the spark plug comes into the cylinder. And that looks like this. And make sure that you put your dot facing forward in the engine. Then you just lower it into the bore like so. And you give it a nice swift push. Like that. Then you can flip it over and install your rod bearing cap. Alright guys, next up is the camshaft. For the camshaft, we are choosing to go with the old reliable Elgin 1840P, otherwise known as the Sloppy Stage 2. Alright, now that the camshaft is installed, we have to install our cam plate. Check to make sure your gasket is present and in good shape. I like to use the flat kind, not the tapered seat ones, because the tapered seat ones tend to crack right here on the lower bolt, and I'm not a fan of that, obviously. Nobody is. And definitely want to Loctite these. If these guys come loose, they're going to get into your camshaft and cause your camshaft to move, so definitely don't want these to come loose. Also, make sure you run the right length bolts on these. Don't just use oil pan bolts, because if you put too long of a bolt on this bottom bolt, it will actually hit the throw of the crankshaft. Next up is our camshaft sprocket. So the pin will be towards the driver's side of the engine, and you basically have to line up the dots. Not super hard, but this can be a little bit tricky with this guide, but not too crazy. All right, you definitely want to Loctite these bolts as well. So while we're up here talking about your camshaft sprocket, let's talk about your cam sensor. So the Gen 3 style engines have a rear cam sensor, so you have to make sure that your camshaft has provisions for that if you plan to run the rear cam sensor. But if you're running a Gen 4 engine like this one, it does not have provisions for the rear cam sensor, and therefore you have to run the cam sensor that is built into the timing chain cover. Depending on what engine management system you plan to run, whether it be stock computer or something of that sort, that will dictate what reluctor wheel you need to have on your camshaft sprocket. What you see here is the one-tooth reluctor. It doesn't really matter to us what reluctor this particular cam sensor has, because we're running a Mega Squirt and it will handle whatever you want, including VVT if you decide to go that direction. Alright, next up, let's talk about the active fuel management ports, which are in the top of the engine. You can see that we have already plugged them off. We bought the Lingenfelter block-off plug kit. Basically, you put a rivet into all of the holes. Now, we are also going to run a DOD delete front or top cover. And it has O-rings here to block any of the oil passages. If you have this plate, you don't really need to block these off, but I've always been skeptical of how well these O-rings seal, and if one fails, you're gonna have a bad day. So, good old Murphy's Law, if it can go wrong. It will go wrong. It is definitely a good idea to delete the active fuel management because that whole system is very prone to failure and has resulted in a lot of premature failures to LS engines. Probably most of the LS engines that we own, we got because they had a premature failure due to the active fuel management. So take that as you will. All right, next up, we will install our lifters. A lot of times we will buy brand new lifters just because we've had issues with reusing lifters in the past. We've actually had an issue on the car that this is going into where a lifter or a couple lifters collapsed and it caused a very noisy valve train, and we had to pull the head to fix it. If you're going to spend money on something, lifters is not a bad place to do it. In the case of this engine, we're actually going to reuse the lifters that we pulled from the previous engine because we haven't had any metal go through the oiling system, and they were brand new when they went into the engine. It's also not a bad idea to replace your lifter trays because a lot of times they will wear and they can cause your lifter to do this sort of thing and cause a premature lifter failure. These are in good shape, so we're going to run them. All right, let's talk about installing your oil pump. Here is another area where we spend a little bit more time on the install of the oil pump than maybe some other folks. So let's talk about oil pump selection. What we have here is a standard volume stock pump, and you can tell that because there is no hole in the side here. If you see a pump with a hole in the side of the housing here, that means it is a high volume pump. Or if you see that it's a melling and it has, you know, a completely different shape and size and says melling on it, then you know it's a high volume pump. But the standard volume pump is what I recommend for most people. What you have to worry about on an LS is pumping the oil pan dry and basically getting all of the oil up into the heads. For most applications, the standard volume pump is more than adequate. Some exceptions to that would be a case where you have lots of extra oil capacity and plan to rev the engine really high, like we are doing on the Nova. We have a melling high volume pump on that car, but for what we're doing with this engine, this pump is more than adequate. There are no dowels to locate this pump in relation to the crank. There is only the bolts, and that is not sufficient to get the pump accurately located. So we follow Melling's guide on how to install the pumps using the shims because we have seen issues where this thing's installed one way or the other, and it results in pressure leaks and inadequate oil pressure. So I'll show you how to do that real quick. It's pretty simple, just involves a bunch of feeler gauges. So first you got to take the pump face off. Then you need to go get a whole bunch of feeler gauges that are between 2 and 3 thousandths, and I'll show you what to do with them next. All right, now you take your shims. You need to locate the oil pump housing. This can be a little bit difficult sometimes. You basically have to squeeze these shims in here like so. I like to get at least 3 spots around the oil pump, like so. And then you need to locate the center. Again, I like to get at least 3 spots here. And you basically got to use every single feeler gauge that you own in order to get this done. Gradually tighten up this oil pump in a crisscross pattern. And that ensures that everything tightens down in the right orientation. Then you can pull all your feeler gauges out and away you go. All right, here is another point of contention that we have with a lot of folks that do Junkyard LS stuff. We put brand new head gaskets on. I've seen the head gaskets mismarked on the front versus back, so be careful of that. The water flows into the block and then it goes up in the back through here and then out the front. So these ports are blocked off in the front and they are open in the back. So be careful to install them correctly. Like I said before, we travel too far to be worried about a used head gasket. Like I said before, we travel too far to be worried about a used head gasket. I've seen the head gaskets mismarked on the front versus back, so be careful of that. The water flows into the block and then it goes up in the back through here and then out the front. So these ports are blocked off in the front and they are open in the back. So be careful to install them correctly. All right, ladies and gents, let's talk about the cylinder heads. So we chose to go with a 243 casting cylinder head. This is the cylinder head that would come on an LS2 or an LS6 or the truck 5.3 liters. I think they put them on some 4.8s as well. This is a very good cylinder head. We chose to go with these cylinder heads because we own them, and a friend of ours actually did a mild port job to the cylinder heads, so they should flow a little bit better than stock. And essentially what we're going to have here is a LS2 with dished pistons and a sloppy stage 2 cam. The only thing I need to do to the cylinder heads before I put them on is I need to change out the valve springs. Previously we were running the LS6 yellow springs, which are good up to about 570 thousandths of lift. And we're going to go to some Pack 1218 valve springs, which are the go-to spring for a sloppy stage 2. So now that we have the head all cleaned up and got our new valve springs on, we need to talk about head bolts. Normally we would just reuse the factory ones, but we suspect that the factory head bolts may be yielded, and lately we've had issues with head gaskets and it seems to be totally out of the blue, and we don't really have a good explanation as to why it's happening. So on this engine we're going to try and install some aftermarket studs. These are from Speedmaster. They're a Chinese head stud, and hopefully they don't snap off on the install, which I hear if you can get past that, they're good to go. And hopefully that will prove out whether the head bolt is the issue or some other factor is the issue. So let's get these in and give it a shot.
Okay, is that good?
Did you screw to the bottom and then...
I think so.
Back out.
I believe so.
You gotta get all the washers on, Mama. The washers.
Where's the washers?
The washers. The Worcestershire.
Worcestershire sauce? Worcestershire sauce.
Uh-oh.
Now, look what you did.
Yeah, how many went down the intake board?
None.
The washers.
The washers. There they go.
What sound do the washers make, Mama?
You people are not right. Paula.
I'm putting that one in the video, Mom.
It wasn't
Washers.
me. It was your daddy. You know it was him.
Okay, they have a direction. This
Which
side
is the
goes
direction?
down.
This side goes down.
Yeah, that side goes down.
Well, let me do it. I have to help. Otherwise,
you can
this
tighten them.
engine's gonna blow up.
Oh, the
I
washers.
thought you knew that.
Okay, now we gotta get lube on the...
Okay, you got a washer there.
Yes. Yes, there's a washer there.
It's a washer.
Washer. Goes whoosh.
Grab a slotted screwdriver, please.
It goes whoosh. Whoosh.
Like a toilet.
This is not a Ford.
Yeah.
Okay, now we gotta whoosh the whooshers.
Okay. I put this one on.
Why don't you do the hard ones? Since your fingers are more narrow.
Here,
Instead of
I
us
can do that.
up here. Go.
Before I get to it. How far do you put it on?
All the way.
Oh, I thought you had a thing to put them on with.
It's called a socket, Mommy.
It's called fingers. Mommy's fingers.
Whoosh the whooshers. I hate doing that. Alright guys, one last thing that we need to talk about are oil pans. So when building a motor, you may not think the oil pan is very important, but it really is. Having the right oil pan can make or break your engine combination, and we've proven that quite a few times. Now, picking an oil pan can come down to what chassis you're going to put the engine in, and that needs to be considered, obviously, but also you need to consider what type of things you're going to be doing with the engine as well. If all you want to do is do burnouts on the street and make dyno numbers, you can get away with a lot. You don't really need that fancy of an oil pan. However, if you want to run the car at the track and cut very low 60-foot times, you really need to consider getting a much better oil pan. In our case, we chose to go with this, which is a Holley 302-3 oil pan. We actually used this on my Ford Fairmont when it had the LS. And the reason that we chose this oil pan is because it's very low profile, so it fits our chassis, and you can get it with optional baffle trays, which have trap doors and keep the oil nice and centered around the pickup. If you are going to run a factory oil pan, there are certain pans that are not great for drag racing, such as the LS1 pan. We have had bad luck with the pickup in the factory location on the LS1 pans, and on most applications I would recommend relocating the oil pickup to the back. And this is common with just about all stock GM oil pans. Most of the time they locate the pickup towards the front of the sump, and if you pull a lot of G's of acceleration, all that oil rushes to the back away from the pickup, and you will starve your engine of oil, and this leads to bad things. Along with the oil pan, if you buy like a Holley oil pan, a lot of times it comes with a pickup that has the dual bolt configuration. If you notice on the factory pumps and all aftermarket pumps, they have 2 bolt provisions, but the factory oil pickup tubes only have a single bolt. To solve that for a factory pickup, you can use one of these, which is just a little hold down bracket, which picks up on the second bolt hole and allows you to hold down the other side. Some people have had issues where the pickup will flex and lose its seal with the oil pump, and this is another failure area that can be easily solved with some aftermarket parts. One other thing to consider is you need to get the right O-ring on your pickup tube. And Melling actually has a good guide as to what O-ring you need compared to what pickup style you have. So once you got that figured out, you're good to go. So let's get this pickup tube installed on the engine and get this oil pan installed. Okay, another thing that I need to tell you about is this little dumbbell right here. The reason that they call it a dumbbell is because it looks like a dumbbell. This is a little plug that you put into the engine to redirect the oil into the oil filter, and then it allows it to go up past and go to the lifter oil feed. There's this little O-ring on the dumbbell, and that O-ring is prone to failure. After many heat cycles, this O-ring can fail, and if it fails, you're going to have a really bad day because you're going to basically have no oil pressure. Unfortunately, the only way to inspect this O-ring is to remove the dumbbell, and the only way to remove the dumbbell is to damage it permanently. So to pull it out, what you need is a wood screw like this guy right here, and you basically drive the wood screw into the dumbbell. And then that gives you something to grab onto so that you can pull the dumbbell out. So we're gonna get the new dumbbell pushed in there and get our rear cover on, and then we'll be good to go. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed our video today of preparing this ported head and cammed LS2 for our Camaro. If you have any questions or you think that I've missed anything in our preparation, make sure you leave it down in the comments below. If you guys have been paying attention to our live streams, you will know that we already got this thing running, and hopefully we'll be making power with it very soon. The next time you see it, it will hopefully be on the dyno, and we will be making power. Make sure you like and subscribe, and also consider becoming a channel member by hitting the join button down next to the subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one.